When creating joints for any model in Maya, by default, the primary axis is going to be the x-axis. Now, usually what this means is that when you actually click out a joint chain, like I'm going to do right here, when you click out your joint chain, the x-axis is automatically going to be the axis that essentially flows through the joint chain relative to the direction you're clicking in. So I clicked out relative to the global orientation right now. So if I look at my orientation, you see that the x-axis follows that. Now if I click out a joint chain in the opposite direction, you'll see that the x-axis reverses in its direction when I click the joints out, except for, okay, so now when I show the orients, you can see now the x-axis is flowing in the opposite direction. Now there are a couple of ways to make adjustments to the orients of your joints. One option is if you can go to the component and to component mode, choose the question mark, make sure you deselect every other selection option, and then you can actually select the rotation orients of every selected object, be it a joint or anything else. And then you can use your rotation tool to manually change the orientation. So if I wanted the X to point upward, I could, and then the Y becomes the primary axis flowing through the joints. But by default, usually I stick with X. Pretty much most setups will focus around, be based on, just because X is the default. I really haven't seen too many people actually go against the default. So the manual orientation of the joints is actually pretty easy, pretty quick, usually less trouble than some of the other methods. But let's take a look at a couple of the other methods. Now, another method you can use to orient joints, go back to object mode, is to use the skeleton orient joint option box. So we got the orient joint panel, which by default, I'll just make sure I reset it, has the primary axis set at the X. And the secondary axis world orientation is in the positive, which means it's going to essentially try to basically flip everything relative to the positive orientation of the world space as opposed to negative. Down is negative, to this side is going to be negative, and towards the back is also going to be negative. So if I switch this to the negative, and I'll go to this joint chain, and I'm going to also, we have a little toggle local axes visibility. This is another way to show the local axes of your joints. Usually you want to disable this once you're not working with it because it does become visually distracting. So we see all the orients are consistent right now with the global orientation, meaning that Y is up, Z is forward, and X is to the side here, to the right, or my right, or screen left. Since I put this on negative, if I apply this, now you see that it actually sort of flips things around a bit. So we still have our x-axis, the primary focus flowing through the joint chain relative to the direction the joint chain was clicked at it. But now the Z and the Y are flipped in the negative. Okay? By default, usually you want the positive. Usually I'll go for the negative if I'm trying to orient something that's on the basically the negative side of the world space, and that's only if I'm trying to mimic behavior. When you mirror a joint chain across the other side and you're going to want to mimic behavior, that means you're basically just trying to input the same value and get the equal opposite behavior. So I could change my primary axis to the Y, and it'll automatically shift it to another axis for the secondary axis. Secondary axis is usually going to be related to essentially what's considered the your up axis relative to the joint flow. So if I apply this, you'll see that now the Z axis is up and our Y runs through the joint chain. Okay, so this is another way to orient joints, but as you can see, it's pretty general. You can do it for individual joints. All you have to do is deselect the orient children of selected joints. That way it'll just do the selected joint. For example, here we have this end joint here, End joints rarely respond to the orientation settings. By default, the end joints will usually just orient to the global space. When you're actually clicking out a joint chain, each joint is oriented by the next joint that's created. And since the end joint doesn't have a joint created after it, it doesn't orient. It just accepts global orientation. So if I wanted to actually orient this joint, I could do it manually, or I could come in and play around with my orient settings to try to get it to do the right thing. So in this case, if we wanted to mimic what's happening with the rest, we'd have to we could apply it. It doesn't really do anything. You could try switching it to negative, and sometimes that'll actually do something. But usually I have to do this manually, or another way to orient things. Since it is within a hierarchy, its orientation and positioning are going to be relative to the joint before it. So if you actually select that joint, go to your attribute editor, and then you find the joint orient. All you have to do is go in and set those X, Y, Z values to 0, and it should orient to match the joint that comes before it in the hierarchy, as I just did. When clicking out joints for something like a leg or an arm, or pretty much any chain where you're actually going to change direction a few times while clicking out your joints, sometimes what will happen is the orientation of the joint, at least the secondary axes, will occasionally flip. So that when you click out your joint chain, you might select it, and when you check your orient, you'll see something like this, where you'll see the y-axis facing one direction. See it sticking out, and as you get to the knee joint, it actually flips around. Now it flips around here just because it does change direction, so it basically just does a sort of a 180 and flips it. But as soon as you change direction back the other direction for the ankle, it flips it back again. And so now we just have this one minor inconsistency in the joint chain, which, as I showed before, is pretty easy to fix. You simply just select it, and then you can manually set your rotation on the X back to 0. But since it's not at the end, it's going to affect the entire chain if you do it via the joint orient, which can be a problem. So in this case, you usually want to do it manually, or you can use your joint orient tool. So you can simply flip it around manually to 0. As you can see, it rotates, sets that joint orientation to 0. Now, I'm not really sure why, if you type it versus manually doing it, it has no effect on the rotation of the ankle. But all I know is that when you do it manually, it tends to work, and it doesn't negatively impact the rest of the leg. This could be a glitch, or perhaps you're actually affecting more than just what's being shown here when you manually type it in. Maybe this orient is actually connected to something else. So as with anything in Maya, it helps to have a few options available, to know a few different methods for approaching a problem, so that when you do encounter something like this, you aren't stumped and you do have choices.